Hello everyone, welcome to Forum Chess Club. So today we are going to look at the main ideas in the Queen's Gambit, which begins with the move pawn to d4, pawn to d5 and pawn to c4. The Queen's Gambit is a gradual strategic opening in which white is aiming to get a slight advantage and space in the beginning phase of the game, and only later gradually it develops into an attack. Let's take a look. So after the move pawn to d4, black will play pawn to d5 and in response pawn to c4. So white is threatening to gain a central majority and extra time with this move pawn takes pawn on d5. So it is natural to ask what happens if black accepts the gambit with the move d takes c4. In fact, this is no longer a very popular option, but it's still a quite viable and it's known as the Queen's Gambit accepted, or in short it is QGA. This is exactly what you're going to look at today. The very first point that every chess student should know is that black can't hold onto the pawn. For example, after the move pawn to e3, black would be in a bad shape if he tried to hold onto this pawn with the move pawn to b5. White wins the pawn back by playing a4, attacking these pawns, breaking these things down, and if black plays a6 as well, we have a pin all right here. If you look at it, this is a pin here. So if pawn takes pawn and pawn takes pawn, and you can able to take the rook. So obviously it doesn't have anything to do with this move a6. So if here they were trying to play the pawn c2 pawn to c6, he would actually run into a really nasty trap here. For example, if you see pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Now b3 would be sufficient to regain the pawn material, but instead white also has a queen to f3, just picking up the material. Black has no choice but to give up a knight here on c6. So this is really a bad idea for black, and because of idea like this, black actually doesn't try to hold on to the pawn which is on c4. He is accepting this gambit, but only temporarily. White will be able to recapture the pawn. Right away there is a couple of interesting questions will arise. If black knows that white will eventually be able to recover the pawn which is on c4, why does he place the Queen's Gambit accepted? Isn't it a good idea to hold on to a central pawn and not trade them the flank pawns? We will see the answer to this in just a moment. And the second question which may arise is, why doesn't white go ahead and occupy the center which is on e4 instead of playing on e3? This is another interesting questions. And in describing the answers to these two questions, we are going to gain some real strategic insight into a Queen's Gambit accepted. First, let's talk about why black chooses to play the Queen's Gambit accepted, even though white will eventually recover the pawn. Black's strategy is to avoid getting bogged down in defending the d pawn, so that he can devote his efforts in attacking white in the center with a counter break of his own, which is generally pawn to c5. Since black hasn't spent any time defending the pawn which is on d5, he keeps his option maximally open to strike at white's center at the first convenient moment. An excellent example of this occurs in the main line after knight f3, knight f6, e3, e6, bishop takes pawn, and now black plays pawn to c5. So this is really interesting because if you think about it, black is applying the exactly same strategy as white did on the move 2. So coming back to the move 2, white played c4 to attack black d pawn. So now later off, after all these moves, it turns out black applying the exactly same strategy. So if you look at it, now black actually trying to attack the d pawn, white's d pawn with the c pawn. So exactly same scenario. In fact, if white also plays pawn takes pawn now or later, and believe it or not, he's just quite often does. So let's just imagine black recaptures with the bishop, and you will see that we get a exactly symmetrical structure. Both the sides have played the exact same moves with their pawns. So what we often see through is white sometimes choose not to take on c5, leading to a symmetrical formation, or he waits for the black to capture on d4, and he accepts an isolated pawn in exchange for piece activity and an extra space. This second strategy is a bit more popular than capturing on the c5. We have begun to touch on our second question, which is, why doesn't white just go ahead and occupy the center e4 square with his pawn after black plays pawn takes pawn? As we just saw, white is anticipating black is going to attack the d pawn with the c5. For this reason, we are reserving the e pawn in case we want to play pawn to e3, as we often do. So this doesn't mean pawn to e4 is a bad move. It just has some drawbacks, which is that both of the pawns might end up being vulnerable. They can be struck at with various pawn breaks or even piece activity, and we will get a chance to see in a moment. After the aggressive move pawn to e4, black has 4 moves which allow him to tickle some of these weaknesses which white has in the center. The most direct move is pawn to e5, going straight for the d4 point right away. Ideally, white would want to continue with either pawn takes pawn or advance the pawn to d5, but both lead to an absolute mess here. For example, pawn takes pawn. And now black's going to rip the queens off from the board and remove the castling rights for white. He shouldn't really have any problem recovering this e5 pawn, and he's going to play suspicious bishop to g4 and then planning for the queenside castle. So this is already an unpleasant situation for white. The king is floating around in the center and we have lost control over the positions very quickly. The other idea you might end up with then would be advance the pawn to d5. But now the pawns are fixed and they become really easy target for black. Black plays knight to f6, knight to c3 and c6. So he just got several attackers on the d5 point. White captures on c4 and it looks like maybe we have consolidated things. Maybe we have held on some advantage here, but black has a great position here and just plays pawn to b5. We can't afford to put our bishop anywhere but b3 because we have got to keep observation on the d5 pawn. So bishop b3 but now just pawn to b4. These pawns are looking very shaky. It's going to be very difficult to find a way for white to find adequate compensation for this attack on the center. It is very difficult to play in these ways, but Gary suggests that white is doing okay and maybe even still has a slight advantage if he plays the knight to f3 in this position. I want to empathize again, this position is perfectly viable for white. It's just not the most popular classical way for white to play against the Queen's Gambit accepted. To give you some other ideas, let's look at knight to f6, attacking the pawn on e4. And this is playing white into, baiting white into playing e5 as he quite often does. Now knight d5, bishop takes pawn, knight b6, bishop to b3, knight c6. This set up a funny little trap, which is that if we play knight to f3, black is ready to pin us with and continue with the attack on the pawn. White often plays knight to e3 just to avoid the pin, bishop to f5, knight b c3, then e6. This is starting to look good for black. Black's got his bishop out of the pawn chain. He fixed the pawns. He is ready to always attack some point with f6 with the pawn here. White often plays a3 just to avoid the minus on the b4 square. Queen to d7. White castles short and castle long for black. And after bishop to e3, pawn to f6. By playing these pawns forward into a fixed position, black has managed to get an attack on these pawns. This is not a bad position for white. It's just a little bit different from the classical situation which we are trying to get with white with the Queen's Gambit accepted. This more or less starts to explain why white often remains from playing pawn to e4. Now another quick thing I want to discuss here is that white often doesn't even play pawn to e3 right away. This is because black has a little trick that I really don't want to describe too much in this position. He can play pawn to e5 here, and this creates some funny little issues for white that he really doesn't want to answer. After all the explanation, as we understand, white preferred move in this position is knight to f3. He's going to play e3 next move, but he's eliminating the tricks pawn to e5 and he's going to play this move gradually. He's not going to just try to blow black up in the center right away. He's just going to gradually rely upon his space advantage in the center. A very classical strategy. Now after the standard book move knight to f6, we play e3 intending to regain the pawn. Now after e6, bishop takes pawn, c5, black has executed his central thrust. White's standard response for here is to castle on the king's side. Now this is a situation for black. He needs to figure out how he's going to continue his development. If he develops, for instance, bishop to e7, this looks like a great time to capture on the c5, and this is what we discuss in a moment. Black's not that excited about moving the bishop quite yet. Instead, his most common move is a6, preparing to bring out the light square bishop, which with pawn to b5 and then bishop to b7. This is one of the key positions in the Queen's Gambit accepted. Now in this key position, there are several ways white can continue, but they tend to fall into two categories: those in which white captures on the c5 and those in which white waits for black to capture on the d4. If white captures on c5 right away, he already gives black a couple little headaches after, for example, bishop takes pawn, queen takes queen, king takes queen. Black's king is in the center. This gives white the chance to develop his rug with tempo harassing the black king. Secondly, white retains his right to move. It's not a lot in this position, but it's actually enough for white to drum up some serious attacking chances if he knows how to handle the position. The theory revolves around whether black can attain equality in this position or whether white can get a nagging advantage that he can use towards the endgame. White has another method to handle these positions. He can encourage black to take on d4. Since after pawn takes pawn, he gains scope for his bishop on c1 as well as half open e5. This leads to the famous isolated queen pawn situation, which we have talked about so much in these videos. The pawn may turn out to be the weak in the long term, but in the short term it's great for providing white pieces with some outpost and then the open files and with some attacking chances, of course, since it's white move in this position. Let's do an example of one of the main lines which contain a4, get rid of the b5 idea. Knight to c6, queen to e2, very logical move, preparing to bring the rook to d1, pawn takes pawn, rook to d1, bishop to e7, pawn takes pawn. So that's the isolated queen's pawn. So now black castles, knight to c3, when white has some extra spaces in the center and has more scope for his pieces. For example, look at the difference between the queen's bishop in both the end. One bishop has plenty of scope and the other is practically stalemated. That is one way white advantage in space is expressed. In this position, he also has a weak square on the b4. Black often plays knight to b4 and gains extra accesses to the d5 square. Over the long term, black hopes to prove that there are some these are all the most important factors. So the theory here is a struggle as to whether white's attacking chances will eventually win out, or will black be able to play for an endgame and control over the center and eventually prove that there is a weaker pawn. There are some other popular and interesting way for white to play against the Queen's Gambit accepted, but I hope that in this video we have managed to look at some of the most important ones and got a really good idea for some of the strategic content of the Queen's Gambit accepted. The Queen's Gambit accepted is viable alternative for players who want to play very solid for black, who are okay with defending patiently and waiting for the opponent to go a little bit wrong, as there are definitely some chances for black to get some good play, especially in the isolated queen pawn position. On the other hand, with white, this is a bit of a happy situation. It turns out that white can often get some good play without much risk, and this is very appealing for white. Based on these two lines, though, if you really take a moment to let these videos deep in and maybe review this video a couple of times, you'll be able to understand more why black tends to choose openings like Queen's Gambit declined or the Slave in response to Queen's Gambit. That's it for today. See you again with another opening. Thank you for watching.